Welcome back to another great episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I'm your host, Dr. J, broadcasting from the City of Angels. Also, we are our home base 107.7 FM UPRN, which is in New Orleans, Louisiana, if you're listening through terrestrial radio. iHeartRadio also carry a Spreaker, all these other things, especially also in the UK, we have Deprogrammed Radio Network. Now, before we get started with an amazing guest, 60 years, that's right, 6 decades of research, I'm going to play you all a clip on YouTube. It's no audio, that way I could talk over it, that I really hope everybody who's out there is following on my YouTube channel. Remember, folks, it's the only YouTube channel that I do watch for the back, that I do pay attention to for during the show. We're getting some feedback. Whoa, got some feedback. Okay, we got that covered there. All right, so everybody, I hope you are watching or paying attention to YouTube on Dr. J Radio Live, because that is the only official chat that I pay attention to. And also, if you are, then you are one of these people privy to see what I'm about to show you, which is this. Somebody, an anonymous source, reached out, oh, not anonymous to me, of course, but anonymous to everyone else, reached out and said he found the location of the Malaysian Flight 370 that crashed 4 years ago. To this day, I don't know if it, some people say it was in Tel Aviv. I've seen weeks later, and then of course we had the one that crashed in Russia that was shot down in Ukraine. Check it out right now. If you're watching YouTube on Dr. J Radio Live, you could see the coordinates. If anybody around that area, which obviously has to be near there, near the continent, or Africa, Southeast Asia, all that area, see what you could do. Go around and look at these exact coordinates, which are 32 degrees 39 minutes 56. Oh, there's just too much. You know what? I'm just going to let you fine folks, go out and look for it yourselves. Now I'm going to transition to our guest. And in the meantime, also in the comments, anybody who has anything to say about Malaysian Flight 370, I'd love to know what your theories are. And what do you think of this video that was brought to me, or the coordinates, and the video was made to show where this wreckage could lie 4 years after the fact? And I was just talking with my guest and the station owner, Joe Montaldo, on how this, aside from Bermuda Triangle and Dragon's Triangle, where things disappear all the time, it's the only plane crash that has never had wreckage, folks. Unless this is it. Personally, I think there's a good probability that this was the one that was found in Ukraine, because of all these other videos and pictures of Tel Aviv and all that. So I just want to know your thoughts. Now we're going to switch gears and go into one of my favorite topics, which of course you all know, is UFOs. Yes, I see Jesse Danner says the airplane would be in pieces. It absolutely would be, but where are these pieces? I want to know. Back to what I was saying. UFOs has been what started me in this voyage of radio. Actually, even going back to 1984, when I really started paying attention to books, magazines, anything that I could find, documentaries on UFOs. And then, of course, that extended to all of the paranormal, especially Sasquatch or Bigfoot or skunk ape or mountain yeti, whatever you want to call it, from the different regions of this planet. I personally think, it's my opinion, and I'm going to get my guest's opinion in a second, if they are the same species, just slightly variant because of their location. So without further ado, I've given you enough time to check out social media so you see where our guest is, who he is. The one and only Mr. Stan Gordon. Stan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on this evening.
It's a pleasure, and I was just telling you that Tuesday night show with Lon Strickler, he mentioned you, and I said that is a coincidence because Stan happens to be coming on Thursday. I didn't know how far back you guys go.
Oh, yeah, we go back quite a ways, and of course, Lon, as myself, we both receive a lot of strange reports on a regular basis, and what I'm finding is that more and more researchers now are beginning to receive the same kind of very strange reports that I've been receiving for years and years. And I began to see some very unusual aspects concerning the Bigfoot phenomena going back to the early 1970s, actually about 1972 and then the 1973. And I started writing about it 45 years ago. And now there's a lot more people beginning to pay a lot more attention to this. And I'm sure tonight we're going to be talking about some subjects that a lot of people have never heard about before concerning Bigfoot. And in some cases, I have no doubt, because I've run across this many times, that a lot of the people in the UFO field, for example, do not want to associate UFOs with Bigfoot. And many people in the Bigfoot field who, of course, believe it's some type of unknown primate, which is something I believed for years and years, don't want to have any association with UFOs. The point is, as you'll hear in some of the cases I worked on over the years, that this is something I was not looking for whatsoever. And these are things that as you're out there doing investigations, you're talking to large numbers of people from widespread areas, they're telling you similar little details and similar details, and you begin to see patterns over the years, and you've got to realize something's going on out there. We just don't know what it is.
You know, it's ironic. I'm glad you mentioned that. A lot of people in the UFO field want nothing to do with Bigfoot, and the same thing with the Bigfoot field. They don't want anything to do with ETs or UFOs. But recently, for me at least, what I've been paying attention to in the last 5 to 10 years, more and more people are starting to talk about the topics together. I remember John Lear 7 years ago, big UFO guy. You probably know John Lear, right?
I have met John over the years.
Okay, well, he was one of the first people on this show, going back 7 years, who said that Bigfoot was in fact an ET that goes in and out of portals, which is why we can't find them, their carcasses or anything like that. But since that time, people, were sort of making fun of him, saying, no, that can't be it. It's just got to be a natural creature on Earth that just happens to elude everybody all the time. But now, more and more people are finally linking the two together. Now, let me take you back in time. 1959, when you were 10 years old. What happened?
Well, it's just kind of a coincidence that I got involved because my birthday happened to be during the Halloween season, and it was a birthday gift my parents had given me on my 10th birthday, which was an AM radio. And I was listening to the AM radio band one evening during that time period, and there was a radio show, and probably more than one at the time, talking about haunted houses and strange creatures and flying saucers. And I was a curious young 10-year-old who was interested in science, and I started going to our local library to read what books they had on the subject. And I became more interested. I started cutting articles out of the newspaper, made scrapbooks. And as time went on, if something would appear in the local paper, somebody claimed they saw something unusual, a UFO, for example, I called them on the phone and interviewed them. I kept records of it. Well, that's how it all started for me. I was 16 years old in 1965 when the UFO incident happened near Kecksburg, Pennsylvania, about 12 miles from where I live. And I got involved in that, and we could talk about that case as well, but I started documenting that as it was breaking on the news around the Pittsburgh area that evening. And I began to go out into the field at that point to do first-hand investigation. And I've been doing it ever since. And now, this year will be 60 years of research. It's going to surprise your listeners. In all the years I've been doing this, I have never personally seen a UFO or Bigfoot myself. I've seen a lot of evidence in the field. I've interviewed thousands of UFO witnesses, hundreds of Bigfoot witnesses, and cryptid witnesses, and witnesses all type of other phenomena, but I've never had my own personal encounter. And but I can tell you, my hotline's been open since 1969. It never stops ringing with reports. I mean, almost every day, current or past reports come in. And it's just incredible what's going on, even the last few weeks with the reports going on here in Pennsylvania. And I'm sure we'll be talking about some of those as well.
Absolutely. Now, before I wanted to ask you the question that just came into my head, which is something that Lon said that I wanted to follow up with you, I want to go back to Kecksburg. If it was what the mainstream media, the Air Force, etc., tells us it is, which is a Russian satellite, why so much secrecy? Why the threats? Why are these strange symbols? I'm Greek. And just so people know that the Greek language is very close to the Russian language, the letters. If it was a Russian spacecraft, then those hieroglyphic type symbols that people have reported on the Kecksburg walnut shaped craft or acorn shaped craft is not Russian. That I can tell you 110% is a fact. Now, what do you think happened? I mean, was it an unmanned ET craft or was it possibly a manned ET craft that actually produced bodies?
Well, we could talk for days about the Kecksburg incident, and I'll give you a little bit of history about it because it's a long, involved story, and you can't even begin in hours to even get into it with any depth. But it was on December 9th, 1965. I first heard about the incident. I was breaking on the news on Pittsburgh area radio and TV that evening, and what we learned, and then I started trying to document the information the next day. There was very little information, but over the years, I tracked down hundreds of people who were involved in the incident. And what we knew about what happened that evening was that multiple witnesses over a very large area from Ontario, Canada, over Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, observed this brilliant fiery object moving across the sky. About 4:47 p.m., multiple reports in the greater Pittsburgh area. And a lot of people were seeing this thing, and they're calling the radio and TV and newspapers and police stations reporting this. Some people thought it was an aircraft may have exploded in the sky. And what we learned is that whatever the object was moved over to the Pittsburgh area, it apparently fell into a wooded ravine near the small farming community of Kecksburg, PA, in Westmoreland County. So it's around 40 miles from Pittsburgh. And there wasn't a lot we knew at that time of that evening. What we did hear on the news breaking that evening was that the military was now arriving in the Kecksburg area to search for an unidentified flying object. Well, what I learned was later on, as I started tracking down sources, was the fact that, one, whatever this object was, and multitudes of people saw it, and I interviewed, I can't even tell you how many people over the years, but many people see this object moving across the sky. It's moving relatively slowly. It was making change in direction along its path, along its trajectory. And some of the locals saw the thing coming down. I mean, some people had this thing pass within a couple hundred feet over their heads before it crashed down into the wooded ravine. And some of the local residents, almost immediately after it fell, ran down into the woods to see what this thing was. And they come across this large, semi-buried, metallic, kind of an off-gold bronze color, acorn-shaped object semi-buried in the ground. Now, there were people that stood within feet of it. And people describe it basically about 10 to 12 feet in length, about 8 to 10 feet in diameter. One solid piece of metal. No weld marks, no seams, no rivet marks, no doorways, no windows, nothing like that. On the raised up back part of the object, shaped like an acorn on that rear section, a raised up back, they said there were these unusual markings on it, more like symbols than lettering. And luckily, one of the witnesses who was there very close to it, because of his family background, he was familiar with Cyrillic. And he said that is not what it was. It was not Russian markings. It was not Soviet. He said these were more like unusual ancient symbols. Well, he based that on the fact that he remembered from that night, because they looked so strange, and over a period of time he went to libraries and read books on it, and he said the closest thing he could see from his memory was it looked similar to ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics. But the interesting thing was what happened during the evening, and I've concentrated my investigation on the activity around the little village of Kecksburg that night, and the hundreds of people that poured into that little farming community that night after hearing about it on radio and TV, because a lot of people wanted to try to get a glimpse of what this thing was down in the woods. Well, first you had some of those local people, and then I was followed by volunteer firemen who were receiving reports that something was seen in the sky and had fallen. The initial reports were this is possibly a downed aircraft in the area, so firemen are out searching for a possible downed aircraft. And as that goes on during the evening, soon after is when the military starts to arrive during the evening, and once the military came into the site and found it, the area was cordoned off and everybody else was told to get out. What the military apparently didn't know was the fact that some locals had already got down in there, and there were some people reportedly actually hiding down in the woods, watching some of the recovery operation. And I was able to find some people involved in that. And it's an amazing story. What we later found out was in the summer of 1990, before we did the Unsolved Mysteries TV show on the case, a man approached me. We were able to check his background, his credentials, and he said he was a member of the Air Force Police, guarded the object when it was recovered from Pennsylvania, from Kecksburg, and came in on a large military flatbed tractor trailer with a tarp over it, came at the Lockbourne Air Force Base near Columbus, Ohio. And he said they backed the object of the trailer into this large hangar. They set up a security perimeter around it, and they would give a shoot-to-kill order to anybody approached the hangar without the proper clearance. Now, he told me he didn't stay on the team much longer, but he heard it only stayed there for a short time, then it continued on to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. And later, I heard information that the object was taken to a particular building, not the infamous Hangar 18, it was another building, and that's where supposedly it ended up. Now, where it's at today, we do not know. But it's an amazing story. Whatever this thing was, there have been many, many theories from the time it happened to even in recent years of what this thing might have been. And the theories and these ideas are all interesting, but nobody has come up and produced any definitive evidence concerning what the origin of this object was. And there's many, many questions still. There have been theories from the time it happened. One of the first that we heard was from family who an Air Force officer we know interviewed. They live within walking distance of where it fell. And that officer told them it was a Gemini capsule that had been expelled in the area, which, of course, we found out that wasn't the case. And, of course, the government explanation was there was a meteor in the sky. Nothing had fallen to the ground. It was just people's imagination. They had seen a bright meteor, but nothing had fallen to the ground. And I clearly remember within days after it happened in this area, many people were talking about seeing a large military flatbed tractor trailer carrying this object out of that area late that night, actually early the next morning, but that was never in the news. And it's an amazing story. Regardless, again, of whatever it was, there's so many details. And again, what's so interesting is that you had so many people involved. I interviewed reporters, and this was so interesting because you had reporters that are on the scene from all the major Pittsburgh area radio, TV, and newspapers. So they became part of the story because many of them either saw the military or interacted with the military themselves. So they confirmed the military presence. Officially, the only military personnel that were on the scene were from what we got from the Project Blue Book report that indicated there were 3 Air Force personnel, and that was it. But multitudes of people confirmed that there was Army and Air Force at the scene. And, what was so important that the military sent in military personnel, and according to various people, and some who have gone public, young kids and teenagers that night tried to sneak down into the woods and were stopped by armed soldiers. And some of these people said that armed soldiers actually aimed their weapons at them to prevent them from going down to the crash site or the impact site. So what was so important down there that they didn't want people to see?
Thank you for saying that, Stan. That was exactly what I was going to say to you. What would be so secret that it would cause military soldiers to point their guns at children if all it was a Gemini spacecraft or a satellite at that? Nothing. Clearly nothing. Now, before I get to what else I wanted to ask you, we've already got some questions in the chat for you. So let me get to these because people and thank you, Lars, for saying what I've always asked people. If in the chat, please write your questions in caps so I can absolutely find them as opposed to sifting through the comments. And I appreciate your comments too. By the way, if you noticed, I am reading all of them while I'm interviewing my guests. So I'm going to go in reverse order, Stan. Nicholas Cashmore asks, what is the most compelling incident that has been shared with you?
Oh my gosh. There are amazing number of cases, and I keep getting more and more. And the case that stands out, and this is something I know you're going to talk about because what we talked about initially here with incidents of UFOs and Bigfoot seen together. So I've got to go back and give you some history of how I got involved in this and led up to this incident. So, as I mentioned, I started my hotline back in 1969, and I began to make contact with the local police and news media about what I was doing. And of course, as anybody who was back in that time period, there was a lot more ridicule dealing with these subjects. And I was still pretty young, but I was trying to make a serious attempt to get the people to at least realize that I was out there if they wanted to talk about what they were experiencing. And it wasn't long that reports got around the area and people became aware of the fact that I was interested in these subjects and they could call me. Well, the phone in my home began to ring around the clock 24 hours a day. And people were calling me about not only UFOs, but anything strange or unusual, from alleged haunted houses and Bigfoot and strange creatures. I was just being overloaded with reports. Well, it got to the point very quickly I realized this is something I couldn't handle on my own. So I was going to try to organize a volunteer group of research people to investigate the reports. So in 1970, I founded the first of 3 research groups. That was called the Westmoreland County UFO Study Group. I started here in my town of Greensburg, where I live, in the hometown, and we moved into the Pittsburgh area. And we did this around our full-time jobs, but I had it organized that we would respond to cases 24 hours a day. I was amazed who I got involved. I had most of the people in the group were specialists. We had scientists and engineers and technicians from many of the corporations around Pittsburgh, from colleges and universities. Dr. Hynek would have called it the invisible college, because the majority of people that did this did it without any publicity. I had police officers, I had former military intelligence people. We had a lot of experts, and we were out there very quickly responding to cases around the clock. So in many cases, we were on the scene within minutes to hours after these incidents occur. So by 1973, we had taken over the whole state of Pennsylvania. So we were getting a lot of reports. And then we were really surprised because we began to get referrals from the news media across the state, from the state police, from other agencies, and we were just overloaded with all kind of reports coming in. So 1973 comes around, and first we experienced this major UFO wave that actually started January 1st and continued right to the end of the year, the last day of the year. And in 1973, you might recall that the United States had a very major outbreak of UFO activity as well, but it mainly peaked in around October on the fall that year. But here in PA, it started the first day of the year. And a lot of these were not lights in the sky. And of course, one thing I'll bring up now, because this is something we always deal with. When I began to go out in the field, I began to realize immediately that whether it was a UFO sighting, a Bigfoot, other phenomena, many of the reports initially were strange and unusual. But when you took the time to properly investigate them, many were determined to be natural or man-made in origin. So there was a lot of things you could explain. However, many of the reports were coming in from very credible people that you could not easily dismiss, and those reports go on year after year. So we had all these reports coming in, and a lot of those sightings of 73, again, a lot of these were low-level observations of large structured craft. Many reports of these things hovering over highways, chasing cars. There were incidents on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, and back then, in 1973, remember now, there was no internet, there was no cell phones. The news media was giving very serious coverage. So there was a lot of media coverage across the state. There was both local and national news reports on our investigations going on. So we're investigating all these UFO reports for one thing. Then, come summer of 73, we had the largest Bigfoot outbreak ever documented. It went on for weeks and months in early 1974. Multitudes of Bigfoot reports. And many of these were in daylight. Many of these were at very close range, as they're continuing to happen even in recent months. Some cases, we had more than one creature seen together at the same time and place. In many instances, our teams or the police or both would be on the scene within minutes, and there would be physical evidence at the scene. So we would have sometimes trails of footprints. And we made many casts of many of the tracks over the years, and there would be other evidence that we would find at different locations. And so all this was going on for months and months. Well, I had always felt from what I knew about Bigfoot, because I was investigating Bigfoot in Pennsylvania in the late 1960s, and historically, Bigfoot was not a new phenomena because there's Native American legends across the state. There were many accounts in the newspapers in the 1800s talking about the wild man of the forest. They didn't call it Bigfoot back then. I have early accounts of Bigfoot encounters in Pennsylvania. One person I interviewed had a return appearances of the creature on their farm up in Fayette County, which you'll hear me talk a lot about back in 1931. And so I had always felt that Bigfoot was probably an unknown type of animal, unknown primate. Well, as these events of 73 are beginning to unfold again, and from widespread areas of the state, and again, there's no internet, there's no Facebook, so people didn't know what other people were reporting. And we began to see some very strange things show up. One of the first things that came to our attention was we get out to some of these locations, and we see these series of tracks under different ground conditions. Everything from, mud and ground and grassy areas and fresh snow in some cases. But in some cases, these tracks would go on for a distance. In many cases, there was a very large stride between the tracks, and the tracks would suddenly stop and vanish and disappear, which made absolutely no sense. There was no way under some of these conditions. We had an anthropologist in the group, by the way, too. There was no way under these conditions that they could have been fabricated. And then we began to see, for example, a UFO sighting in a particular area. Within minutes to hours or days later, we'd have a Bigfoot sighting in the same area, or vice versa. And then we began to have these really strange cases with Bigfoot and UFO seen together at the same time and place. And before I get into it, I want to try to stress this because nobody knows I don't have the answers. Nobody has the answers. I am not trying to state that Bigfoot is a passenger riding around in a spaceship from another planet. We have no idea what we're dealing with, and the more I know about the phenomena, the stranger it is. We don't know for sure what these UFOs really are. I've said for years and years from the data that I've seen that we may be dealing with more than one origin for the unknown category. Maybe a small number are extraterrestrial. But what if some of these are, for a lack of a better term, interdimensional? Because I have many cases of UFOs, even in daylight, where these things suddenly appear out of nowhere, they physically change form, they appear and disappear. There's some unusual elements of that as well. So we don't know for sure what we're dealing with the UFO phenomena either. And so anyhow, these cases are unfolding. One case, and I'm just giving you a few examples. September 27th, north of Pittsburgh. That evening, there was two young ladies waiting for a friend to pick them up out in the country. They see this 7-8 foot tall, huge, hairy Bigfoot with white hair. We do get reports of white hair-covered creatures on occasion. It's running across the road towards a wooded area. That was enough for them to just be really shook up. But in one of its hands, it's carrying a small ball of light.
Whoa.
And as it runs into the woods a short time later, this object comes across the sky and projects a beam of light down in the woods where the creature ran into. We thought, well, that's pretty interesting. But as to answer the question of the person that asked the question, the case that really made my team, and I can tell I had a lot of skeptical scientists who, spending time out in the field and seeing what was going on, began to realize that there's something going on out here, and this is one of the cases. This was up outside of Uniontown, PA, in October of 73 during this wave. And I got a call from a state trooper from the Uniontown barracks, and I'm going to give you the briefest part of the story. It's a very long, probably one of the strangest stories ever recorded. The whole thing I wrote up in my Silent Invasion book. And October 25th, 1973, I got a call from this trooper. He was a little shook up. He said, I just came back from investigating this incident. He said, I think there's a good chance there's something still up on the farm. Can you get a team up here as soon as you can? So it was already late, but we did. We got our team together. We got our radio equipment, our radiation equipment, and we got packed up, and we found our way up to Fayette County. So what we learned was that about 9 o'clock that night, in this rural community, about 15 people, they're watching this barn-sized, big red ball of light about 100 feet off the ground and moving down towards the farm pasture.
That's huge.
And
barn-sized?
Big as a barn, huge thing. And they're watching this thing getting lower and lower, And what happened was that night, the fellow on the farm, his son was coming out to visit him. So the son's riding down the road. He sees the people standing outside looking at this thing. So he goes to a higher location to get a better look, and it looks like it's going to land on his dad's property. So there were two young boys up there. The fellow and the two boys decide they want to go up and see what this thing is. So he runs over to his dad's farm, and he grabs a 30-06 and a handful of ammunition. And they proceed down the farm road, and as they're getting closer to the area, first they hear this high-pitched whining sound. They hear these loud baby crying sounds, and the dogs all around the area are going crazy. And they make their way up to the top of the hill, up to the top where the pasture is, and they're standing there because they can't believe what they're seeing. This huge object is now on the ground or right above it. But now it's like a half a sphere, like half a ball, like a big white dome, illuminating the whole area, making this high-pitched whining noise. And they're just standing there in amazement because they can't believe what they're seeing. And then there's a barbed wire fence about 75 feet away. They began to look at that fence because along that barbed wire fence are these two huge, tall, bipedal, hair-covered creatures, one behind the other, walking in their direction very slowly, one behind the other. The one in front's about 8 feet tall. The one behind is about 7 feet tall. Well, the older fellow's been an avid hunter. He knows bear. That's his first thought, they got to be bear. But then he soon realized that these things, they're taller. They're covered with long, dark, matted hair hanging off the body. They have no neck. The arms are so long, they're down below these almost to the ground. They're making this loud, high-pitched, whining, baby crying sound. They have luminous, glowing green eyes. And the one kid looks at him, and he runs out of the field. He's so scared. And the other kid starts yelling for the guy to shoot at them. So he didn't realize it when he had been to the farm, but when he grabbed that ammunition, he had 2 tracers in there as well as live ammo. So you just got luminous trail when you fire those tracers. He fires one tracer, no effect. He fires the second tracer. The largest of the 2 creatures lets out this loud baby crying sound as it reaches out as though to grab at the tracer. And at the same time that happens, that huge object in the field vanishes and disappears. It doesn't take off. It's just gone. It disappears. At that point, the creatures slowly turn around along that fence line, start walking back towards the woods. The guy at that point starts firing live ammo, excuse me, from his 30-06. And I remember he told me until he passed away, he said, I'll never forget how that huge, biggest creature kept staring at me with his glowing green eyes as I'm pumping live ammo from my 30-06 into it with no effect on it whatsoever. So they ran back to the truck and went back to the farmhouse, got the family out of there, took them to the neighbors and called the state police. When the trooper arrived an hour later, 45 minutes later, they went up in the patrol car up in the area to look for evidence. And again, this is the short part of the story. But the trooper told me the area where the object had been on the ground was self-luminescent glowing, but 100 feet or more in diameter. He said if he shined his flashlight beam to it, he could barely see the beam. He said the farm animals wouldn't go anywhere near it, and he said if he had a newspaper, he could have read the newspaper from the light coming off the glowing area. They both went back to the barracks. Both the trooper and the witness were taken to 2 separate rooms and separately interviewed, and then they called me to send my team up. And that's just a part of the story. It got even stranger during the night. But it was the case that stuck with all of us and convinced us that there was a lot more to the Bigfoot phenomena than any of us could ever imagine. And then it got even stranger than that.
What happened after that? I mean, first of all, I'm just still blown away that someone firing live ammo of a 30-06. I hope people understand that's a huge caliber. I mean, that is a fatal shot. And you have an 800 to 1,200 pound beast that is just taking the rounds?
Well, then the stories got even more fascinating. You know, somewhere around that time, I'm sure I'm talking to my team, and I'm thinking about all these Bigfoot reports going on, and I kept thinking, you know, you look at all this data, it just, something doesn't make any sense here. If these creatures have been around Pennsylvania and around the country and around the world for so many years, and nobody's ever come up with a body, something just doesn't make any sense here. Well, then, again, as all these reports are continuing, the reports get stranger and stranger. So, for example, in November 73, up in the mountains of Fayette County, a fella is running his hunting dogs at night on his property, and ahead of him in the woods, he sees a tall, dark figure, and then wondering, like, who's trespassing my property? He starts yelling to this person, and as he gets closer, he realizes this is not a person, but this is a large, hair-covered, almost ape-like creature. So he grabs his pistol and starts shooting this thing, and he said he was sure he hit it, but he said when he shot at it, it physically disappeared, but he could still hear it running off into the woods. Well, that was interesting. And then we had the case that was the one that convinced me, as reluctant as I am to say it, that we well may be dealing with a phenomena that's much stranger than a flesh and blood animal, and for a lack of a better term, we might be dealing with something that's interdimensional or from another reality. And this is a case that happened in February of 1974, up in that same general area. And I remember this very well. It was, and many of the listeners will remember this time period because we had a big national trucker strike. There was a lot of violence across the country. There was gas rationing, so a lot of people remember that. And I couldn't get up to the scene the next morning because I couldn't get gas. Well, what I found out happened that night, here's a woman that lived in a little cabin home deep in the mountains up in Fayette County. She had lived there forever. She knew animals very well. She pretty much wasn't afraid of much of anything. She was a very good shot, and she was watching TV that night, just sitting there relaxing as normal, when she began to hear, she had some pop cans, a pile of pop cans on her front porch, and someone was knocking the pop cans around. And she's thinking, well, you know, we had some of those wild dogs, a pack of wild dogs came through a couple of weeks ago. I'll bet those dogs are back. So she thought, you know what, I'll grab my shotgun, and I'll load a chamber, and I'll shoot over the head and scare them dogs away. So she goes over and grabs her shotgun and loads the chamber, and she walks over to the wall and turns on the outside, the switch for the outside porch light, and she walks to the front door, and she opens up the door, and she walks on the porch. No dogs around, but right in front of her, I mean, we're talking 2 to 3 feet away, here's this huge 7-foot tall, maybe taller, hair-covered Bigfoot creature with his arms straight up over his head, and she fires right into it with her shotgun.
Nothing, right?
She said there's this bright flash of light, like the flash on a camera, and it disappeared right in front of her. Now, the interesting part of it is, her in-laws lived 100 feet away, and they heard the gunshot, and they called her, asked her what she's shooting at, and she explained to him. So her son-in-law grabs his sidearm, starts walking down that dark road to the house, and he said he's surrounded by 4 or 5 hairy people with eyes like coals of fire, starts shooting at him randomly, runs into the cabin, and then about that same time period, there's this large object, they said like a big Christmas ornament hovering over the woods at the same time.
You know, I gotta say, this is really interesting because most of the time I hear about Bigfoot, it seems to be a solitary creature. So for you to, or for cases to have come about where there's 2, or like in this case you said 4, or was it 4 or 5?
Yeah, they said it was like a group of them out in the yard. Yeah, there was only one on her porch that she shot at.
That's insane, and the fact that people are shooting him and nothing's really happening. It's at what level of caliber, or do you have to go even beyond that to RPG, which no civilian in America at least can get their hands on legally at least. Very, very startling if I was to run across one of these things. Honestly, I couldn't tell you what I would do. I definitely would not be a deer in headlights. I would run. I probably wouldn't pull out my iPhones and whip them out and start recording unless I was at a safe distance, because I can only imagine the speed that they run. Stan, we got plenty more questions that have racked up. Do you want to take them?
Sure, we'll be glad to.
Okay, Two-Headed Tasmanian. What does Stan think of Todd Standing's video and proof of Bigfoot?
Well, you know, I'm so busy. I try to keep up what goes on around the country. I deal mainly in Pennsylvania because I'm constantly working on Pennsylvania case, and I see a lot of these great videos on TV, and I believe I remember seeing that one, and it looked very interesting. But since I'm not out there doing first-hand investigation, I don't like to comment on these things because I don't know firsthand about a lot of the background, a lot of these reports, but I know a lot of people I've talked to found it very fascinating, interesting, and I have to leave it up to other people looking to these reports.
Now, this is Space Cowboy 6879. I'm going to reword the question here. What was the worst hoax or most ridiculous hoax someone tried to pull on you?
Very interestingly, all the years I've been doing this, very rarely have we had any overt hoaxes. We got a lot of cases where, credible people report seeing something that turns out to be misidentifications. And, we get a lot of reports of Chinese lanterns and, of course, drone reports and a lot of things that are very unusual. Sometimes we have lights reflecting off of birds, and there's a lot of things we can track down. But the people are credible. They're not making up the story. Now, during that wave of 73, before there was any news publicity about these events, we had been getting reports. And when that started getting publicity and a lot of people began to hear about it, that's when, of course, some of the hoaxes turned out. And the hoaxes were generally in the way of footprints. And it was very easy to decipher the real tracks from the fabricated tracks. So, we haven't really dealt with a lot of hoax cases over the years. You do get a few, but they're far and few between.
I'm going to ask this in reverse because this is a continuation from Space Cowboy before I go to Jesse Danner's question. What is your best way of seeing if someone is telling you the truth?
Well, over the years when you interview thousands of people, and one of the things is I like to, in many, many cases, each case is different, but over the years, we would get out to the scene and do first-hand investigation, first-hand interviews, and look over the areas and make sure all the details were correct. But when I interview people today, and of course, not every case warrants, and you can't go everywhere. And what I look for is how people react, the little details they give us, and it's so interesting because when you talk to so many people, and there's many of them are so reluctant to even want to talk to you or even be identified, and they don't want to be identified. 99% of people I interview want no publicity whatsoever. And you go to these details, you go to the patterns. There's certain things they tell me quite often that's very common with many of the reports. Those are the things I look for. And just to see the emotion. I can tell you of a case that happened outside of Pittsburgh last year. This happened on a two-lane farm road, country road, pouring down rain down in the Mon Valley outside of Pittsburgh. There's been a lot of history of Bigfoot sightings, and this guy riding down the road, and he sees something about 50 feet in front of him on the left side of the road. He has his low beams on. He moves up closer, turns on his high beams, and this huge 7-foot-tall Bigfoot steps out on the road and stops 5 feet in front of his car, looking directly at him in his face with glowing red eyes.
Red eyes?
Or bright, luminous red eyes, which we've had in many other cases, too, where there's no reflective light, very luminous eyes. He got a hold of me soon after it happened. He was verbally shaking on the phone. We were down the next morning searching for evidence. Unfortunately, it poured all night. There was leaves everywhere. Couldn't find. But, he was physically shaking, describing this to us. And he gave us one of the best descriptions I've ever heard from head to toe what this thing looked like. And when you see somebody like that, and I've seen so many people, hunters and people from all walks of life who had encounters, and I've always said the best witnesses are people that don't believe these things can take place until they have their own personal encounter. I interviewed a hunter a few days ago that had an experience in the last week, 2 turkey hunters here in Pennsylvania. And, you can just tell talking to this guy, he's been out in the woods all his life. He knows animals of all types, the sounds, what they do. And he said whatever this was that he encountered, there was something it wasn't supposed to be. He was very emotional about it. And those are the kind of things you look for.
That, and if I'm in a physical presence of someone, micro expressions really tell a lot about what someone is saying. But like you said, if there's that much emotion and fear, trembling and all that, well, I really hardly doubt that something like that would be a hoax. Anyhow, Jesse Danner's question. What do you think about the Indian Army finding Bigfoot footprints in the Himalayas?
Well, of course, that's a great national story, brought a lot of attention to the subject, but once again, not being there to look at the tracks and examine the tracks, you can only go by what you're reading in the news. So once again, it's very hard to determine that. And I was interested, I believe, in some of the follow-up where they said they may have been bear tracks, because those were unusually large footprints, if I recall. And we had actually an incident here in Pennsylvania, several incidents back, oh my gosh, years ago. Can't remember, maybe 20-some years ago, during a heavy winter storm, and we were getting reports of huge, much larger than normal alleged Bigfoot tracks in some areas. And we were having some odd weather conditions at the time, as I recall. There were heavy snow, then you had a bright sun, it got warm, and then it melted quickly, and then it froze again. And my team would get out some of these areas, and I remember we got some pretty good close-up views of some of these tracks, and they did appear to be bear tracks, but what was happening was you would have the hind legs catch up with the front tracks, you would have this impression in the snow, then it was melting, and it would spread and it enlarge bigger and bigger. It looked like one huge humanoid footprint, and then it froze. And at least in some of those cases, we believe that that's probably what it was. It was from weather-related conditions. I don't know if it has anything to do with what happened up there, but I'm just saying we had something somewhat similar.
Now, before I ask the next question, this is my own question. We have Bigfoot, Sasquatch, the skunk ape, mountain yeti. Are they all the same species or just subspecies of the very elusive Bigfoot?
Well, there's similarities but differences, and I know some people who have really studied it thoroughly. They feel that some of these creatures are more common in certain parts of the country. Some are taller, some are smaller, but here in Pennsylvania, almost everything has been reported around the country has been reported here. We've had the small ones even the last week and a half. We had a report of a 4.5 to 5 foot tall creature was seen. We've had reports years ago of larger ones and smaller ones being seen. And one of the things that I bring up about this unusual aspects of Bigfoot I've been looking into for years and years. I have a whole lecture I do just on the subject called Strange Aspects of the Elusive Bigfoot. And one of the things that I get into is the footprints, because we've all seen those large five-toed tracks have been seen throughout the country in Pacific Northwest and Canada and Oregon and California and everywhere, and they've shown up all over the country, including up here in Pennsylvania. But also, and some people know about this, some people don't, in almost all these areas around the country, three-toed tracks have also shown up, sometimes four-toed tracks. And I think that's very, very interesting. And not only that, but in Pennsylvania, again, there have been other numerous tracks that we've looked into. And we've made casts of some of these tracks and got a lot of pictures of them. These do not appear to be fabricated. The witnesses appear to be sincere. And some of these tracks have continued over as reported from widespread areas, but they're not well known. For example, we're getting more reports of like the Ponjan tracks, like ape tracks have been showing up on and off over the years in Pennsylvania. So there's a lot more mystery here. You can't have so many multiple unknown creatures being seen by credible people. So there's got to be something else involved. And you mentioned this earlier when we were talking, the more I know about a lot of this phenomena, I don't have the answers for it. I mean, personally, the more I look into these things, the stranger the reports are getting, I really think we're dealing with phenomena that's beyond our present scientific understanding. I don't think anybody has the answer, including our government. I think it's very possible that, of course, with UFOs, that government knows a lot more than they're telling us, but they may not have the answer themselves, and there's some indication they have the interest in Bigfoot as well. And I think also that they may be finding out that Bigfoot might be stranger than a lot of people realize, and they may not have the answers to that as well. But I think someday we'll have the instrumentation, the technology to understand more about this. But right now, we're just gathering a lot of data. And it's interesting because these strange reports that I began finding years ago, it's not just what I'm finding. I began to make contact back in the 70s with researchers throughout the world and around the country. And many of them, even back then, were very much aware of these similar reports. But a lot of them said They were reluctant to publish them because they were afraid of getting laughed at by their peers. The witnesses didn't want to talk about it. But I can tell you, in more recent years, from all over the country, many people in the Bigfoot field are beginning to pay a lot more attention to this. And many other researchers, Lon Strickler, Nick Redfern, Linda Godfrey, there's so many researchers out there that are receiving the same kind of reports from around the country and around the world. And I think just from the amount of lectures I do and the people come up to me everywhere I go and share their experiences with me, and most of these are unreported reports, it is very likely that the whole phenomena is much more, it goes on much more commonly than people realize, and some of these strange aspects of these cases may well be going on much more that have been occurring, but they're not reported, so we don't have really good data how much of this is going on.
Agreed. Definitely agreed. We don't have enough data, and that's why we need more people like you and more people who see things to report them. You do have a hotline that you've operated since, 1969, and it's still going on to this day?
Yes, and between that and the emails I get through my website, I receive lots of emails, a lot of calls all the time about these phenomena. I deal mainly in Pennsylvania, but I do get calls from many other areas as well.
Now, this question is totally ironic. I was just called today to be on a show next Thursday called, I think, it's not the Paracast. The point is one of the things we were talking about is at Mount Shasta, that there's a lot of Bigfoot sightings along with extraterrestrial sightings. And the reason why I'm saying this is, or UFO sightings, because this next question has something to do with it. It's Kai Smith says, has Stan visited East Ranch to check out the Bigfoot phenomenon there?
In Mount Shasta? I couldn't hear the end of it. Did you ask if I've been to Mount Shasta?
Have you visited the East Ranch, James Gilliland Ranch in Mount Shasta?
I have not, no.
Okay. Let me find you the next one. I'm trying to, hopefully people, if you are listening, if you can write them in caps, you're making it far more easier for me, but I am doing my best to go through even the non-capped letters to ask, to find which ones are questions. Okay, Lasha Senyak. Does Stan Gordon think Bigfoot is a physical being or a dimensional one or an alien?
Well, alien doesn't necessarily mean extraterrestrial. And again, I keep an open mind to all possibilities with all these cases. I can't say that all these Bigfoot reports have something indicating there's something stranger than a flesh and blood animal, but we're getting more and more reports. And I'll tell you about some of the more recent reports here in a few minutes. But one thing I found years ago, and it continues to happen, it's a pattern, it's an interesting pattern. Many close-range, low-level UFO sightings, and many encounters with Bigfoot, other cryptids such as these huge Thunderbird sightings, these huge flying creatures that have been reported around the country, but many in Pennsylvania, Black Panther sightings, so out-of-place animals, other strange entity reports we're getting in Pennsylvania, winged humanoids, other strange creatures are showing up. They commonly occur in the vicinity of energy sources. So many, many sightings around high-tension power lines and power plants and gas wells and gas lines and radio towers and reservoirs and lakes and railroad tracks. It goes on and on and on. I have no doubt there's an energy connection to the phenomena we're dealing with. And there are multiple reports I can get into and talk to you about that suggest that there's something more to Bigfoot, in some cases just flesh and blood. In some cases, we have people who are seeing a creature that's physically solid. In other cases we have people who are seeing a creature that some of the body is solid, some is kind of misty or out of focus. We've had reports. I've had cases, and I can tell you many, many reports over the years of some really strange cases going on. I had one case years ago during the 70s when a police officer called me and said this fella that afternoon along the Chestnut Ridge, and we'll talk about the Chestnut Ridge. Chestnut Ridge is a mountain range here in southwest Pennsylvania that extends about 100 miles long through Westmoreland, where I'm at, Fayette, Indiana County, to near Preston County, West Virginia. And it is probably one of the most active areas in the country year after year for encounters with UFOs, Bigfoot, other cryptids, mystery booms, weird phenomena goes on all along the ridge, even this year already. And so a lot of strange things happen up around the Chestnut Ridge. But the police officer called because he said this fella came in to the office. He was very, very shook up. He said he and his wife were taking a leisurely drive that afternoon, and they're riding down the road, and suddenly this huge, hairy Bigfoot walked out right in front of their car, and they hit it. And he said upon impact, it physically disappeared. Wow. And he said the guy seemed very shook up, seemed very, just like a normal person, but he was just very shook up over the incident and wanted to report it to somebody. But those are the kind of things you hear. And there's many other things that have been turning up. For example, in the last few years, all around Pennsylvania and around the country, many, many Bigfoot researchers are telling me that they've gone out in the areas where there's been a history of Bigfoot activity, and they're looking for Bigfoot evidence, but they're not finding Bigfoot, but they're encountering strange orbs of light, strange balls of light, these very unusual, oversized firefly-type phenomena they're reporting. That's going on more and more. And, for example, May 10th of 2016, up in Fayette County, near Fairchance, where there's been a lot of history of Bigfoot activity, one of my associate researchers, Jim Brown, investigated a case where two men were riding down this very rural road that night, very foggy, heavy rain. From the left side of the road, about 20 feet away, this huge 7-foot tall, hair-covered creature runs down in front of the car, in front of the road, and stands 20 feet in front of the vehicle. The two men are standing there looking at this thing, again, glowing red eyes, staring at the fellows in the car. At one point, the driver slowly backs the car up, then he moves it very slowly forward towards the creature, which is just standing there. He actually has the bumper of the car against its leg. It turns and has his hands on the front of the car. Then it picks his hands up, turns around, walks off to the road. And,
nothing. So essentially nothing happened to the Bigfoot, the creature.
No, not in that case. But within the week, other Bigfoot investigators went up in that area to look for evidence, and they were coming back reporting, independent groups of researchers, seeing these strange lights in the area they could not identify.
Speaking of hotspots, this is great. A lot of people in the chat are very engaged and have a lot of questions and are definitely digging what you have to say and appreciating it for being such a good researcher for 60 years. Okay, Ben Willard, why are certain hotspots or certain areas hotspots for UFO and Bigfoot sightings?
Well, once again, I don't think we know. I think, again, as I mentioned previously, there seems to be an energy connection to the phenomena, so there might be something in those particular areas that are attracting the phenomena, or the phenomena needs it to, who knows, come into our physical reality. Just like with many of the Bigfoot encounters, these little details you keep watching, and a lot of the TV shows you hear, and a lot of the interviews of witnesses around the country, the witnesses talk about this terrible, overpowering smell, this rotten egg smell, this sulfur smell, this smell like something that's been dead for a long time, that quite often accompanies the appearance of the creature. But in many cases, there's no smell whatsoever. My feeling is that, just a thought on it, that the smell has something to do with the process of these creatures, whatever they are, that come into our physical reality, go from one reality to another. It's just a thought. But I had the opportunity to smell it myself years ago during that wave of 73. And I'll tell you the story because it's interesting. This is the kind of things we were dealing with. A police officer called me to come down to interview two women. This was August of 73. It was a very warm night. This lady's sleeping, and she's tossing around and had the feeling somebody is looking at her, and she turns, and just a few feet from the bed is the window, and here this creature was bent down in the window because it was so tall. It had pulled the drapes back and was looking directly at her. And she gave a very detailed account of what this creature looked like. She said when it walked back from the window, she said, as I recall, she heard no sound, which she thought was unusual. A short time later, this thing walked around the house, and her daughter's on the other side and started screaming that she had just seen the largest shadow she had ever seen. And moments later, this terrible odor just penetrates the area and in the house. And the two women called the police because they heard rumors that the police had shot and killed one of these creatures, been in the news, and they wanted to see it because the one woman wanted to see it was similar to what she had seen. And, of course, that was not true. The police had not shot anything. But they called the police officer. He interviewed them, felt that they were being very truthful and very shook up. He called me to get down and interview them. You could still smell the odor in their home 3 days later. It smelled like something had been dead for a long time.
That actually reminds me of the skunk ape. Before I resume the questions, because we got a lot in the chat, do you think that the smell is relative to the smell that people report in Florida when they see or a skunk ape is in the area?
Well, once again, in some cases when people are seeing these creatures, they smell this rotten odor. But in other cases, there's no smell
Nothing
whatsoever.
at all. Yeah. Very weird. This question, again from Lasha, and let me preface this by saying, let me just ask it first. What does Stan think of the reports of Bigfoot having telepathic contact with people? Let me say one thing about that. I personally think that's a good reason why they elude us so much, because they could sense us so far away, not from sound, but maybe can read our thoughts and say, okay, humans are out here looking for us or hunting, and let's go over there. But then, what's your take on that? Telepathy.
Well, once again, this is a very interesting question because in my lecture I cover, again, many things a lot of people never heard about with Bigfoot. And there is, I do bring up the report that some people believe that these creatures try to telepathically communicate with them. I can tell you here in Pennsylvania, the cases I worked on, which is hundreds, it's an extreme rarity to hear these reports. But I understand they're much more common out in the western part of the country and other parts of the country as well. But I will tell you a couple of the incidents. Back in this area, back in, so my memory is 1979, there was an area, a rural area outside of Westmoreland County, and this all began when people saw some kind of an object fall from the sky during the afternoon in a field. Soon after, the people around the area began to hear screams and cries, see unusual footprints. They began to report Bigfoot sightings, strange lights, and all kind of phenomena went on for a couple of years. And many people were experiencing this and actually began to make the local news around here. And so all that was going on. One of the persons who were involved in this told me that at least 2 times he felt that one of these creatures was trying to communicate with him mentally. In one case, I remember him telling me, he said something gave him the mental impression to go back down to the gas line, which he did, and he saw this huge hairy creature cross along the gas line into the woods. So that was interesting. I remember another case, and actually this one I can vouch for because I was there when this occurred. This was not far from the Chestnut Ridge around Lake Tropier back years and years ago when we were getting a lot of reports of sightings down along the ridge and around the ridge area. And my team went out to interview several people who had been seeing this creature at close range. And one of the persons in that group claimed that one of these creatures, again, was trying to mentally communicate. While we were there, this person said this creature just communicated that tomorrow morning, the next morning, about 15 miles away, so we're in Westmoreland County. They're telling me in another county, Indiana County, up near a little town, and named the town, that there would be a UFO incident early the next morning. And early the next morning, multiple reports of this strange, high-pitched sound very low over that town. It was enough to have the fire departments and the police conduct a search and even got into the news. So that was really interesting because the person actually named the town where this occurred.
Wow. Now, when you say high-pitched sound, are you talking about something that would be emitted from a craft or a high-pitched scream?
No, it was something in the air. And they checked, there was no aircraft in trouble, nothing missing. They couldn't be sure what the sound was, but it was an unusual sound. It was very low over that area, and many people reporting it.
Wow. Two-Headed Tasmanian asks, now this is pure speculation, is Wookiee from Star Wars based on Bigfoot?
Something, I hear a lot of stories, but I do not know that. I have no way of knowing that.
No problem. Okay, let's see. We got plenty more here. I'm just trying to sift through the ones that make sure I don't miss any that are not in caps. If they're in caps, like I said, folks, I could definitely pick them out far more easier. All right, Manuel Silva. Is it true that the U.S. allowed UFO abductions to take place for an exchange of extraterrestrial technology?
Once again, a lot of stories out there, a lot of speculation. I have no way to know if that's true. I can just tell you this. I was probably one of the first researchers in the country to get involved with my teams back in the 60s of people who claim they are being abducted. And you could spend a lot of time on one alleged case like that. And we had multitudes of cases coming in all the time. So we were limited. I mean, we were all working full time. We were doing this out of our own pockets. And you can only do so much of what we were able to do. But we interviewed a number of people from widespread areas. I mean, some very, very credible people, very educated people, people who something apparently happened in their lives that had a dramatic effect on them. Some that had missing time experiences. And I cannot say that these people were abducted and taken aboard an alien spacecraft, but something happened to some of these people that directly affected their lives. And I can tell, even years later now, I can think of one person in particular that I dealt with this person and her family now for, oh my gosh, probably going on 50 years. And when this first happened to her, she was a young girl that was missing for a long time, and there was a massive search for her. And they had searched for hours and hours, and then they ended up finding her in the middle of this field where she had been before they had looked many times. And she said she was there the whole time. Well, throughout her life, she began to have paranormal experience from the time she was little. She later had encounters with UFOs, Bigfoot. But then, interestingly, her children began to have the experiences and her grandchildren. And they still have things go on even in recent years. And this is something I have seen from other people who claim that these things are going on. And once again, you asked earlier, is there any connection between all these different phenomena? And the more I'm looking into a lot of the cryptid reports, the similarities, the paranormal stuff, I talked to a lot of people who are into the ghosts and the haunting investigations, which I'm interested in, but that's not the thing I'm really involved in. But when I started in this, I was mainly involved in UFO research. I wasn't out looking for the Bigfoot phenomena and all the other weird things going on. But as you're out there and you're interviewing so many people from widespread areas who don't know each other, and they're reluctant to talk to you, and then sometimes they'll come up and say, well, there's something else I kind of want to tell you about, but I really don't want to talk about because you're going to think I'm crazy. And you get so many people talking about these similar things that are going on that you begin to realize there's a lot more to this, and some of this stuff might somehow be related because so many people are telling us the same story. And just like what you had out in the Skinwalker Ranch, well, we were having those kind of phenomena here in the 70s. And there are other places around the country and here in Pennsylvania where the same type of thing is going on. Many of the UFO sightings and Bigfoot and other cryptid encounters, they periodically occur in many locations. And again, one of the things that's interesting, in more recent years, we're getting more and more reports in more populated areas near larger cities where there's very little woods, which is interesting too. But in some of these cases, again, I can think of one example on a property several years ago where a farm and everything was normal. Then all of a sudden, they began to have apparitions and strange footprints and screams and Bigfoot appearances and UFOs, and other people have experienced it as well. And my understanding is it's still ongoing. So these things do go on periodically. It seems as though while a lot of the phenomena can happen anywhere, sometimes for whatever reason, it seems to focus on a particular area and goes on for quite a period of time.
This question has to do with Pennsylvania, and I was going to mention that earlier when we were talking about it, but it's a specific county. This is from DRC. Has there been any recent reports in Clearfield County, Pennsylvania?
I can't tell you exactly in Clearfield, but I can tell you in the last few years, I know I've had incidents up around Clearfield County, But there have been numerous reports just a little further up. So there have been numerous reports, including in the last week, up and around Tionesta and Forest County, and there have been many reports. There's a lot of Bigfoot activity up there around the Allegheny National Forest, up around Kinzua Dam, that whole area. There's a lot of reports of a lot of phenomena. I know we had a thunderbird sighting, one of these huge giant bird sightings not far from there. I believe it was about 2 years ago. There's been other reports of all. I know I've had UFO sightings up there, but it goes on everywhere. And it's just you don't hear about it because 99% of the witnesses don't want any publicity.
It's true, very true. And you know what? When Stanton Friedman, rest in peace, he used to always at his lectures, when talking about UFOs, would say, okay, in this group of people, how many of you had seen UFOs? And a lot of hands would pop up. Then he'd say, how many of you reported it to MUFON or anything else? And he said it's usually about 10%. And you know what? Unfortunately, I'm guilty for my sightings from 84 to 90. I never reported them. And I can't even say I reported my 2012 sighting other than capturing it on video and sending it to Third Phase of Moon, which got me started with them. But that's just a whole separate topic. Anyhow, okay. We asked Kai Smith. Oh, no. Kai Smith's question. Has anyone been attacked by any of the Bigfoot they have reported to you?
Good. Another question. That's a good point to bring up. Of the hundreds of cases I've worked on, these creatures at times will throw large rocks or actually small boulders towards people, but not hitting them, which, again, people bring up and think it's very interesting that their aim is so good that they can easily hurt them if they wanted to but didn't want to hurt them. Sometimes they'll throw large branches, but for cases of these things actually going after people and hurting them, it's something it's nothing that shows up in my cases. I've had people, and again, I don't recommend people shooting at these things, but over the years, we've had quite a number of people who have shot at these creatures with various weapons. Nobody's ever brought one down. In a few cases, the thing fell to the ground and then got back up and walked off. But no, I mean, I remember one case also a number of years ago where several fellas encountered one of these creatures at night, and they had a very high-powered light beam with them. And they shined in the eyes of this creature, and of course, he had his hands up blocking his eyes. It was very, very upset, apparently, from the bright light in their eyes, and it chased him for a short distance towards the car, and they actually said this thing followed him for a very short distance as the car was moving down the road, then it stopped and moved off. But even the other cases I've had where people shot at them or people were seen to be trying to provoke it a little bit or try to challenge it a little bit, it just turned to walk off into the woods.
Speaking of shooting at them, there was a comment that I passed earlier here where someone mentioned that the 30-06 was what I think it was Teddy Roosevelt used to kill the Big Five in Africa. Now, if elephants and other giant creatures are able to be killed with such a high caliber round, why isn't this creature being affected unless it's being protected by some sort of field around it? Again, so many different questions that are just one more thing to consider. Now, here's Rolf Pfeiffer Muller's first question. What are your thoughts regarding Tom Biscardi, or is Biscardi a hoaxer? And do you know Jody Cook works?
I've only heard of both of them. I've never met these people, so I don't comment on these things because I've never personally met these people, so I can't give you any good ideas.
Justin Thomas asked about Sasquatch in Pennsylvania. You did cover that. If there's anything else, now's the time.
Okay, you kind of cut out there. Are you asking me if there's anything else I want to bring up about Bigfoot?
Justin Thomas's question, because we already talked about Pennsylvania twice at least so far, and so it's a third time it's being asked. Justin Thomas asks, can Stan talk about Sasquatch in Pennsylvania? So that's why I'm saying if there's anything outside of what you already said, if you want to address it.
Oh my gosh, we could talk for days and days about the incidents and sightings in Pennsylvania. But let me give you an idea about some of the things that have occurred in the last year and even more recently. And again, some of these reports now, and again, they come from the general public. these aren't coming from people who are interested in Bigfoot. Most of these are just normal, everyday people. Many of them had no interest, never saw one, never believed in them before. And anyhow, that's what's going on. And one case, and this was back in, I believe it was in September. And this was a few miles from the Chestnut Ridge out in Derry Township. This gentleman's riding down the road that night. It's raining. He said about 75 feet in front of him, he said this thing appeared out of nowhere in the middle of the road, moving from left to right. He said it had a very large humanoid shape, very broad-shouldered, muscular, kind of stooped over like it had bad posture. But he said the whole form was misty and foggy, but you could see the whole thing. Except it was kind of a foggy white form, about 6.5 to 7 feet tall. And he said what was so unusual, and again, this is not the unreported, I guess, but he said it appeared to be floating across the road into the field and disappeared. So about 2 weeks later, up on the top of the ridge, on that side, the Derry Ridge, a person's taking a nice walk. It was a beautiful day. Person hears something in the woods, about 20 feet, had a noise in the woods. She walks in, and about 20 feet in front of her, there's this large, old, dark tree stump. And she's looking at this tree stump and realizes there's this 7-foot-tall, shaggy, hair-covered creature hugging the tree with its long arms completely wrapped around the tree like it's trying to camouflage itself from her. It has its cheeks against the tree, and she said it has very dark eyes, in this case, staring directly at her. So she's looking at this thing, and she runs. She's just petrified. She runs to a tree about 10 feet away to try to get her composure, to set her camera to run up and get a picture. She runs up a short time later, and it's gone. And again, here's another thing where she never heard it coming, she never heard it going. Then we talked about that incident down there in the Mon Valley where the creature walked out in front of the car, 5 feet in front of the car, down in early November of last year. And the interesting part of that story was, as I mentioned, the thing, it was so close to the car at that point, he couldn't even see the bottom of its legs until it turned and it started running across the road up a little hill, which he began to follow in his car. Then he could see its very long arms and legs and the hair hanging off of it. And he loaded his camera to try to get a picture, and he said, suddenly it was just gone. He said it was dark, he had his headlights on, but it just wasn't there anymore. And that kind of bothered him as well. And in late November last year, outside of Greensburg here on a 4-lane toll road, a man contacted me, and he was a driver of one of the vehicles. He had a passenger in the car, another vehicle pulled up next to him. They're riding down the road. They have the high beams on, and they slow down because here's this 8-foot-tall, very wide-shouldered creature with long arms standing in the middle of the highway. And he said the weirdest thing was it never stopped and turned and walked away. It vanished and disappeared right in front of us.
Wow.
And those are the kind of reports we're getting. And then in just February of this year, a couple I talked to, and they didn't even want to talk to anybody. They told this to a relative, and a relative said, you should report this. And they were going to work early morning like they did every day. Could care less about Bigfoot, didn't believe in Bigfoot. And anyhow, this person tells me they're riding down this road, and suddenly this thing comes out of nowhere, and about 50 feet in front of the vehicle, and walks out in front of the car, and it goes into the woods and it's gone. And this person, again, was telling a relative, so the relative called me, and I'm asking the relatives questions because the people didn't want to talk to me, and I realized they were there, and finally the wife, who had the best view of this thing, got on the phone, and we had a long interview, very detailed interview, and then she sent me a long written statement. And here's what she said in part of the statement. Let's see. The whole encounter seemed to happen so fast, it was long enough that I could get a glimpse of him from head to toe, but it felt like he was gone before I could blink or even look away. I felt like in the movie Predator, how Predator can be invisible, and then he can glitch out, and you're able to see him. That's what I thought happened with Bigfoot. He was all of a sudden there, and out of nowhere, and then it disappeared. Now, why would you talk about something? Why would you make something like that up?
Truthfully, I think it's less about cloaking and more about going into another dimension and something like that, because a lot of people who either film reports or just UFO reports or film UFOs or just see them talk about the way they just sort of blink out, which is not just, going in a straight line from one place to another. And besides, this goes to something I've always been saying, and so have physicists for years, that if you are able to use artificial gravity waves and bend space and time, by default, you're creating wormholes. That's what you're doing. Einstein-Rosen bridges. So I definitely think one of the reasons why these things are so elusive and disappear like this is because they are literally going into another dimension.
And, I've studied and investigated many other kind of cryptids, including a lot of Black Panther sightings. And this is interesting, too, because, when we talk about Black Panthers, people generally think of black leopards, black jaguars, animals not common to Pennsylvania and many other areas of the country. But people have been reporting them for years and years. I mean, in the last few years, I've had hunters in daylight see these things 30 feet away. Been many, many reports. I mean, we had an incident, I believe it was 1983, 85, somewhere in the suburb of Pittsburgh, a very busy area of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. There was a large auto dealership, and there was a big fence separating that from a large wooded area. And this actually made the news, by the way. And that morning this happened, there was a mechanic putting a headlight on a car. And suddenly this huge Black Panther dives over the fence, over the vehicle, and lands a few feet in front of him. It's standing there staring at him, growling at him with a dead animal in its mouth. And, I mean, he's close enough to see its ugly teeth. He can hear it. He can smell it. And it turns and jumps back over the fence, and it's gone. But other people saw that one and a smaller one side by side. So that led to a big search by the Pittsburgh police and animal people with tranquilizer guns. They searched and never found a thing. There's nothing missing in the area. And when you hear these cases, there's not that many of them in captivity around here, and they never seem to be missing. And so here's another little.
They're not. Here's
another little aspect.
They're not local to the Americas, right?
Correct. But here's the stranger thing, and this is another part of the Bigfoot phenomenon a lot of people don't know about. Sometimes when you have a localized outbreak of Bigfoot in a certain area, like the one I told you about in 79, 81, 82, where there was a lot of UFOs and Bigfoot being seen, at the same time, they're having an outbreak of Black Panther sightings in the same area. But there have been instances around the country where more than one type of cryptid are seen together. So sometimes you have people seeing a Bigfoot and a Black Panther together, or some other type of cryptid. That's another thing a lot of people don't know about. And here's a story that you'll find very fascinating. This is, again, from Fayette County many, many years ago. I went up to interview this fellow. Early morning hours out in the country. He brought his car home late that night. His car was overheating. He went into the garage to get some antifreeze. He's putting some antifreeze in the car, and he hears this loud growl. So he turns around, looking about 20 feet away. Here's this very large black house cat growling at him. He didn't pay too much attention to it. So he goes back to putting the fluid into his vehicle, and he hears a louder growl, and he turns around, and now that house cat is physically about another foot larger. And he can't believe what he's seeing, and he runs into the house to go look for his pistol. And when he comes back out, this now very large house cat looks like a full-size Black Panther, like he would see in the zoo. You would see in the zoo. It has glowing, luminous yellow eyes. He takes a shot at it. The thing walks up the road and physically disappears right in front of him.
Wow. This question is out of order, but because we were talking about Pennsylvania, Hadley Scott McIntyre wanted to know if it's eastern or western Pennsylvania. I'm assuming, before you answer this, Stan, it's all of Pennsylvania, or am I correct? Is it eastern or western only that has more of the hot spots?
A lot of what we're talking about is basically in western or southwestern Pennsylvania, but there have been reports all over the state. I've had reports last year in northern PA, eastern PA, some reports in northern PA very recently, but I've had reports all over the state, but we get a lot of the activity in the southwestern part of Pennsylvania around the greater Pittsburgh area and all through the mountains and valleys around this area.
Justin Thomas asks, is Stan familiar with the K1E Lasperitis research on a psychic Sasquatch? I hope I said that right, Justin.
I think it's talking about, I believe his name is Jack Lasperitis, who's a researcher.
Yes, and the last name is correct. That's right. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, he's called me a couple times years ago. I know he's written at least 2 books, I believe, on the subject, and he apparently deals with a lot of people who claim they're in telepathic communication with Bigfoot. As I mentioned, of the hundreds of cases I've worked on, it's a very extreme rarity up here. But apparently in some parts of the country, it's much more common. And I've talked to a couple of those people over the years. I've never met them in person, but I've talked to some people. And, they claim sincerely that they've had communication with these things. I can tell you, a number of years ago, I can't remember now, maybe 8, 9 years ago, I was invited to come out to the McMinnville, Oregon UFO conference to speak. And that's right in the middle of Bigfoot country. And I talked about this particular subject. And I thought, well, I'm probably going to get a lot of people who are going to think this was negative about what I'm saying about Bigfoot. I was amazed at the positive response I got. I had many witnesses and many researchers come up to me afterwards. Many of them contacted me later and said, we are so glad that you brought that up, because the same thing is going on out here. We've had tracks that suddenly stop and disappear. We've had the creature disappear physically. And everywhere I'm going, and I've talked to so many people around the country, the same thing has been going on around the country and around the world, and there is a lot more of this phenomena than any of us understand.
This is also about Pennsylvania from Justin Thomas. Have any of the Sasquatch howls been recorded in Pennsylvania?
Yes, they have. Over the years, there were some sounds recorded, especially back in the 70s. One of the things we were finding was some of the most common audible sounds people were reporting was like a woman in pain screaming, baby crying, sound like very heavy breathing, like somebody with asthma, high-pitched bird whistle. But then we had cases where humans were very close to these creatures, and they seemed to be able to mimic both human and almost any other sound they wanted to. But there have been other sounds reported too. I mean, what hunters and people tell me when they encounter some of these creatures, the audible vocalization is just terrific. I mean, the volume of the sound is something they can't even begin to describe. It just tears through their body and shakes them. It's so loud and so vibrant. And many of them talk about the fear they felt at that time. And I've had people and hunters tell me about this the last couple of years. I had a wildlife biologist contact me probably 3 or 4 years ago from, I believe, in eastern Pennsylvania, and this guy was an expert on animal sounds from around the country, and he happened to be in an area of Pennsylvania, and he said, I've always been kind of skeptical of Bigfoot, but he said, I heard this sound more than once within a couple days, and unfortunately he tried to record it, but it was too far away, he couldn't do it, but he heard it, and he said what he heard and the length of that vocalization was unlike anything he'd ever heard before. And 2 days before, I was getting reports up on the Chestnut Ridge from people describing almost the same type of sound. I can tell you, not too long ago, I heard a vocalization had been taped where you could hear the sound of coyotes, but behind the sound of the coyotes howling, you hear this very loud, strange vocalization that was completely different than the coyotes. And, so many of the people have been reporting. Last year, as I was mentioning, it was just a very interesting surge of reports that went on all year from January. It's continued right through 2019. And during the winter, we were getting reports of tracks in the snow from many areas, and people were sending photographs in. One of the tracks, the video that was sent, which was very interesting, and this was in North Huntington, PA, outside of Pittsburgh. It was a beautiful early morning snow. The people got up and saw it. They look out their window, and they're kind of stumped because here's a series of huge, like 16-inch footprints in the fresh snow, 4 to 5 foot stride between the tracks. They go for quite a distance. They get over to their children's playground, and their tracks suddenly stop and vanish.
Again,
and when they
disappearing.
Go to see, and when they go to see where they began, they figured they probably walked across a road and it came through a yard, but it didn't. They just like suddenly appeared in the yard, went a distance, and disappeared. And we had another series of tracks similar this past February near the ridge as well, in another area. So we were getting that, and then as the year went on, through the months in the May, we began to get multitudes of reports from widespread areas, some people calling in. And a lot of these were experienced hunters and outdoorsmen. And they said, we're hearing screams and cries and howls unlike anything we've ever heard before. They said, we know coyotes, we know all these sounds, we know fishers, we know what the sounds are. These are something completely different. And then some people were reporting, and again, a lot of these places had a history of sightings because we have been up in these other counties. And some of these people are telling us on a beautiful day, they're hearing trees cracking, trees breaking, and we were deep into the woods, way deep in some of these areas, and we were seeing healthy, fresh trees, maybe 8, 9, 10 feet tall, that the branches were twisted off and broken.
Wow.
And I'm familiar a lot with the weather phenomena, and this was not like microbursts. There was no other damage in the area. I mean, this is just some really oddities are showing up. We're seeing, we've seen these before, and of course, some of the one area we were in. This guy is a, I would say, a semi-professional hunter. He's been out in the woods all his life. He knows animals, and he said it's so bizarre when you hear the scream. He said all of a sudden, all the normal nature sounds will go quiet. The frogs will stop. The birds will stop whistling. Sometimes you'll hear somebody walking in the woods in the distance. And then in one area he found an area. Now we've all seen deer lays around here where deer lie down. We know what those look like, but these areas are different. The way the ground is matted and the way they're formed and the size. He had never seen like it before, and we've seen similar type of patterns like this over the years at other locations. So a lot of interesting things were showing up, and then we were getting the actual encounters of Bigfoot from so many different areas and so many people reporting things. And once again, it's not just Black Panthers, it's not just Bigfoot. We're getting other weird entity sightings, and I'll give you one that you'll find very fascinating here. This all started actually in late August of 2017 here in western Pennsylvania. This is a police officer on patrol. He contacted me soon after he got off his shift. He said this was the strangest, weirdest thing he had ever seen. So he's riding down this area that he patrolled, and he sees what looks like a ball of light on the road. But he's thinking, I've never seen artificial lighting like that before. He slows down, he's looking at this thing, and he said suddenly that ball of light rose up or stood up from the ground. And he said the ball of light was actually the head of a very strange being that looked to be about 6 feet tall or larger. He said it was tall and almost skeletal thin. And there was, of course, no hair on it. And he said apparently at first it was laying on its belly on the ground with its head facing the road. Then it stood up and faced the road. In the dark location, he saw the dull light from the glowing head illuminating the upper section of the creature's body. He said the creature turned to the right, the dull illumination of the head lit up the shoulder area, then turned and faced him, then turned to the left and took off at an incredible speed towards the darker location. He said the speed that you could only call abnormal. It ran faster than anything I'd ever seen. It was there, and then it was gone. It's just like the Bigfoot witnesses were telling us. It's suddenly there, and it's gone. He said this thing was 6 feet tall or larger. The head was about 8 to 10 inches in diameter, shaped like a ball, but it may have had somewhat of an egg shape. The light emitted as a dull white. It illuminated the shoulders, the top of the chest, and the section of the arms. He said he could not see the hands. The chest would be about 18 inches across. The waist appeared to be small, but the arms were abnormally long. The long limbs looked skeletal with no muscle mass. The skin tone of the body appeared to be dull, grayish blue, but he could not see any facial features. When the thing took off, he pulled his patrol car up and put his spotlight on, but there were no tracks there. Within 2 weeks, I received another report from another area several miles away of a person describing basically the same thing without the glowing head that came up within about 35 feet of the person out of the woods. There have been several other reports now from Allegheny and Westmoreland County, and I happened to be at a private event several weeks ago, and just as I'm leaving, one of the persons in this family pulled me over and said, I got to tell you about something that happened to me and what I saw. And now I'm waiting, hopefully they talk to him in more detail, but I was there and saw exactly where it happened. And this guy's been an avid hunter all his life, and his family said he won't even go out in the woods anymore after seeing this thing. And he described seeing a creature very much like what the police officer saw without the glowing head. But this thing, and these people live in a very thick rural area, this thing came down over the woods and apparently was crouched down in front of this big glass back door, the face of the woods. The guy was sitting there at the table eating. It was 10 feet away, staring at him, crouched down through the back door window, looking directly at him.
Wow.
And, I mean, just amazing, these reports coming in about these other creatures as well.
This next question, and let me just say this. Even though we're supposed to end in about 15 minutes, I'm probably going to go a few minutes over because I want to make sure everyone's question is answered. Now, this next one I really like because this is something that has not been covered as much. So here it comes. This is from Rural Pfeiffer Muller. Are you acquainted with a Dyatlov incident supposedly perpetuated by Bigfoot-like entity corroborated by many researchers like Paul Stonehill? And do you know the Urals, URALS mountain mysteries?
Now, once again, these things I've heard years ago, and again, it's only things I've read. I'm not that familiar with them. I've got too much to deal with here firsthand, so I don't like to comment again on something I really am not that familiar with.
Okay. I can give you the background in just a quick sentence of the Dyatlov Pass incident. It was a group, I don't know if they were researchers, but they were staying overnight in tents, and they essentially disappeared. And what they found when they came with a rescue group, I believe this was in Russia, and anyone in the chat can correct me if I'm wrong, said that some of these people, they had tears from the inside of their tents as if they were trying to get away from something that was frightening them. And also, some of the clothes, socks, etc. were in the tents, and some of the footprints were of barefoot, meaning the people who were that scared of whatever was harassing them, frightening them, etc. at night, that they literally left the heat of their blankets in their tents to get out as far as they can, sometimes some of them even naked. And that's why this case has always been at the back of my mind looking for an explanation. Now, are we ever going to find it as more time goes? I don't know, especially since the Iron Curtain seems to come down, but hey, all we can do is continue to ask. Okay.
Yeah, and yes, I'm familiar with the case to that degree, but again, it's a long, interesting story. Not directly involved in it. I can only say I don't know what happened there, but something apparently very interesting did. But not typical of the cases I worked on, of the many, many cases where these things appear to be sometimes, as I said, throwing like rocks and small boulders and branches at people, and probably to get them out of their area. But highly unusual for these things to go after people and actually harm somebody in the cases I've looked at.
Yeah. Okay, this is from William Schermerhorn. What about large 50-pound crows in Maryland?
Well, I don't know about the 50-pound crows, but I'll tell you a little bit about the Thunderbird sightings in Pennsylvania. And they go back for many, many years. But we're talking about these Thunderbird reports, and I kind of put these various reports under that category, even though there's a similarity, but some different in the descriptions. A lot of these reports we're getting, these things are like huge, giant, overgrown turkey vultures. But people are telling us these things are standing 3 to 4 feet tall, and we're talking wingspans of 10 to over 20 feet, like a small aircraft. And once again, just like with UFO sightings, very difficult to judge altitude and size when something's in the air. But in some of these cases, these huge flying creatures were very close to the ground, or actually they're on the ground, blocking cars, eating roadkill. And in neighboring West Virginia years ago, I interviewed a person who that morning was on a 2-lane country road. This huge flying creature was eating roadkill right in front of his vehicle. He was staring at each other, and he's watching the wingtips of this thing flapping its wings, trying to get his huge body off the ground. And as the wings are flapping, he's looking at the gravel and the dirt going up on the edge of the road. And this thing finally gets up and over the trees, and he goes back the next day to measure the width. It was 21 feet across.
You know, this actually reminds me of the Mothman. Wasn't that in West Virginia as well?
Yeah, well, that was back in 1966, 67 when all the Mothman stuff was going on. So then it gets even more interesting. You don't have just these huge, giant bird reports. Then you get reports of these huge, leathery, no feather, leathery covered, more bat-like creatures that people have been reporting for years. And then people who are really reluctant to tell me, they swear they're seeing something that looks more like something that's prehistoric, like pterodactyls, teratorns. One case recently, we had a little wave of these reports early this year in Pennsylvania and other states. And Lon may have had some of those. I'm sure he did as well. And I know one person told me down in the Mon Valley, again, we talk about a Bigfoot down there, but I think there's a lot of cryptids down there. In the afternoon, 2 witnesses see this huge bird, but on the end of its tail, it had this football-shaped appendage, which other people reported with what they believe are something that looks prehistoric, like some of these huge flying lizards from prehistoric times.
Wow.
So that's interesting as well. And then you've got these other reports. One that's most interesting is what they now have nicknamed the Butler Gargoyle from Butler County, which is north of Pittsburgh. And I investigated this primary case, which I've interviewed this witness many, many times, very professional, very good background. And in March of 2011, he's riding early morning hours, it's dark, he's riding down this back road, and he catches something in his headlights about 50 yards ahead, and something's hunched down in the field. He thought it was a deer, but as he gets closer, this huge 8-foot-tall creature rises up from the ground and takes 3 big steps across the road into the woods in front of him. And he said to me, he said, you know, people talk about seeing Bigfoot around here. He said, this thing was not a Bigfoot. He said, this thing's at least 8 foot tall. And actually he had walked out in front of a big road sign. And that road sign was over 8 feet, was around 8 feet, and this thing was a little taller. And he said, this thing had smooth leather-like skin over the body. It was kind of a dark tan or light brown color. He said it never looked at him. He only saw it from the side. The head appeared to be flat in the front and then rounded out, kind of like an aerodynamic helmet. And the top of the head was not quite a point, but looked like a ridge on top of the head. The face was flat. The eyes were not clearly defined. He thought the ears, from the left side, it looked kind of long and flat and came up in the back and kind of pointed like a flap. The arms were muscular and a little longer than that of a human, but the hands had claws. And the one trait that really stuck out were the legs. He said the legs were extremely muscular, but he said the legs did not move like that of a human. They looked like almost they were bent backwards. And he said it had wings tucked into its back, which were tucked into its body, and the wingtips extended toward the side of the head.
Wow. And
he got a very good look at it. And within days, other people in that general area were reporting the same thing. There's a small group up there called BORU, the Butler Organization of Research for the Unexplained, and they interviewed some of these people. And the reports were all very, very similar. And here, I'll give you one of the witness accounts from there that they interviewed. This was up near, I believe, Reimersburg, up in that area, and these people were near a little restaurant up there, and they see this thing crossing the road. They said this thing came within 35 feet of the creature. They said it was at least 9 feet tall, had dark brown skin, long arms, and broad shoulder, had a pointed head, flat forehead, and pointed ears, and what appeared to be wings on its back. The body was extremely muscular. There were 4 finger-like claws in each hand. The eyes were squinted but swept upwards at the corner. The movement of the arms were not normal. The mouth looked like a slit. The wings looked like see-through mesh and resembled wings on a bat. The claws were black as coal. The witness stated this thing was straight from hell.
Jeez. Wow. And you know what? If other people are accepting the fact that there are other dimensions, this may very well be coming from another dimension, or it could be something that is living amongst us, but very few people notice and report. Okay, Hadley Scott McIntyre. Do you think the Bigfoot / Sasquatch roam like nomads?
Very tough question to answer. Again, we've had sightings for years and years in Pennsylvania. I know different people have looked to see if there were certain areas where they seem to stay in more commonly. We know from history, from the people actually seeing them eating food, especially in our area, they like apples, corn, and berries. We've had reports of them chasing deer and carrying deer over their shoulders. And so you got reports from a lot of areas, and of course Pennsylvania is full of forests and woods and mountainous areas, so there's a lot of places for something to hide. And one thing we did, when we were getting a lot of these reports back in the 70s, and there would be sightings, and some of these sightings would occur around mines and caves, my teams would go into those mines and caves and look for evidence. And we found no evidence of these. They may have gone in there just for a short time to stay, but there was no evidence these things were living in any of those dwellings. And that, again, is another part of the phenomenon. Like, where do these things hide? Where do they sustain this much food all year round? Again, if we were dealing with an unknown primate, which I always thought, well, some of these things may come about. But more and more what we look like we're dealing with, we may be dealing with something that has its own traits, and it may not fit in with an unknown animal. And once again, I don't have the answers. I can only tell you what we're uncovering. I mean, we've just barely even touched on the reports we're getting, what's been going on for years and years. And I can tell in the last few years, some reports are getting even stranger than the strange.
I definitely agree with you that both things that you just said. First of all, they are getting stranger than strange as the times pass, and also we are only at the tip of the iceberg. I mean, if only we could imagine if only we can know what's really out there to the extent of it, I really think people would be blown away. Anyhow, okay, Justin Thomas. This is more of an opinion, but definitely I'd like your comment on it, and so would Justin. Maybe these cryptids are coming from the inner earth, and are they emerging from tunnels and or ley lines?
Well, that's a theory that's been brought up for a long time. But in the multitudes of cases I've worked on, I've never seen any indication that these things, were coming out of like underground tunnels in Pennsylvania. I've heard others around the country speculate on that, and I can't say it isn't happening in some areas, but when I have so many reports from different people who are seeing these things appearing and disappearing right in front of them, and I know around the country people have talked about seeing these things walking off and suddenly just disappearing. And again, it's not just Bigfoot. It's all these other strange creature reports as well. We're getting so many reports. And, I began to notice some interesting little details, especially in the last couple of years. I've talked to Lon about this and others. And one of the things that I found really interesting with some of these encounters with even the Dogman reports and the Bigfoot reports and even the Thunderbirds and other creatures is the fact that sometimes when human observers come upon these creatures and they're very, very close to them, the creatures suddenly realize that they're able to be seen, and they give this startled effect. They have a startled look, startled action. They move very quickly as though they think they can't be seen, but when they realize that they can, they're very, very upset over it.
I've actually heard that very same thing. It's almost as if that their frequency is such that they are normally invisible, and for whatever reason, at that point in time that they're being viewed, that whatever frequency or the vibrations change that they're emanating, and therefore are able to be seen. And hence, when they realize, even though they're looking at you and they think they're invisible, but once they realize you're looking back at them, I definitely have heard so many reports of them being startled, and ranging from all sorts of cryptic creatures, from Sasquatch, Bigfoot, to extraterrestrials. I mean, anything of the such. Even though some have telepathy, even they get startled when they're seen. So I thought that was a very great for you to say. Now, this is another thing about Pennsylvania from Justin Thomas. What of native cultures of Pennsylvania do they have tradition of Sasquatch in their history?
Well, I know some people have really done a lot of study on this. I can just off the top of my head, one that's interesting was down around Lancaster and York County down in eastern PA. And one incident happened was a researcher several years ago who was riding down the road early that morning out in Lancaster. And early morning hours, it's dark, and he has his lights on. And ahead of him on the dark road, it looks to be what appears to be a small child playing in the middle of the road. He's thinking, what is a little child doing this time of morning playing on the road by himself? As he gets closer, comes right up on this thing, he realizes it's not a child, but it's a very small, maybe, I believe around 4.5, 5 foot tall, skinny Bigfoot covered with black hair. He puts his high beams on. At that point, the thing realizes the guy's there. It turns around, looks right at him. I believe they had glowing yellow eyes. They're looking at each other, and the researcher says the creature physically disappeared right in front of them. And back in that area, the Native Americans have what they call the Alpid Witch, which is a small, little hairy type Bigfoot that's been seen reportedly over the years.
Now, let me ask you, since we definitely should start to wind down, since we technically should have been off air 3 minutes, but I said we would go a little after to make sure I accommodate all the questions. Now, before we came on air, we were talking about waves, and you mentioned this current wave that's been going on. I think you said it started last year to now, and it's still happening?
Yeah. Now, it's nothing to the intensity that we had back in 73 and the 74, but it's more than normal, really interesting, detailed reports from so many people over widespread areas. Started in January last year, and it's never slowed down. It's continued right through the winter of this year, which generally the winter time things slow down, but we've had constant reports. I mean, I have pages of reports from this year right through the last few days. And just to give you, and again, I don't have the whole report in front of me right now, but first, I think it was around May 1st, early in May, outside of Pittsburgh, early morning, this fellow was looking out his window, and he sees this small Bigfoot, maybe 4.5, 5 feet tall. And here's what's interesting: he watches this thing as it's walking through a yard into this heavy area of woods. It walks into the tree line, and seconds later, coming right out of that same location where the creature walked into, is this small little sphere of light that I've been telling you about. Other people and Bigfoot people have been reporting. This little sphere of light, it moves very slowly. It suddenly goes out. A few seconds later, it appears, I think, about 10 feet away. And this time when it appears, there's a beam of light coming out of it. It stays out for a few seconds, and it disappears, and they never sees it again. So here, once again, you've got a Bigfoot creature with this strange light phenomena. What is that all about?
Agreed. Very much agreed. This has been a super fascinating show. One of the comments, I think more than one, is actually that this show went way too fast. Another one is that you are a true treasure trove of information. And of course, people are requesting you back. And I already knew that within the first couple of minutes of speaking to you before we went on air. I knew you are loaded with amazing information. And one of the things we want to go more into depth next time is the Kecksburg Incident, also known as Pennsylvania's Roswell. Let me just say one thing about Roswell in general. You might find this interesting because I just came across this. Now, the I-beam that was recreated by Jesse Marcel Jr. Long before he passed away, actually, the symbols on it are Greek. They've changed some symbols. For instance, the E looks more like a line down the middle with 3 lines that would be an E, but it's the lines in the middle instead of onto the left. And it spells out in Greek eleftheria, which means freedom. Why would the Roswell wreckage have some Greek writing is the key. Greece is not one of these countries that has the resources like the US or the former Soviet Union, currently Russia or China or anything like that to create such fabulous spacecraft or any sort of craft that would have crashed in our own backyard. I thought that was very stunning. I just came upon that information yesterday, as a matter of fact, so I wanted to share that to everybody listening and to you, Stan. I don't know what's your take about that? What do you think is that? Do you think that's even possible to have ancient, not necessarily ancient Greek, but older Greek writing on Roswell wreckage?
Well, of course, that's interesting, and there have been other cases around the world where there have been alleged hieroglyphic markings found too, and of course we have the strange symbols on Kecksburg, but we can't be exactly sure exactly what they were because they're from the memory of some who stood near the craft. But you've got similar reports from around the world, and so it's a fascinating aspect for people to look into.
It is. Now, I want to thank you again for this amazing show, and I want to give you some time. I see, obviously, I posted a picture of your book, Silent Invasion, and you have others. Let's talk about where people can buy your books, the names of them, your website, and everything else.
Okay, well, the website is stangordon.info, I-N-F-O, so Stan, G-O-R-D-O-N, stangordon.info, and there's a lot of reports on there. What you see on there is just a sampling of the multitudes of reports I get, but I do update it. There's a lot of events I'll be speaking at later this year still, a lot in Pennsylvania, so people around Pennsylvania can attend some of those. There's a lot of interesting details of cases from years ago that are very detailed and fascinating. And so anyhow, the website's on there. The contact information to reach me by phone and by email is on there, but my email address, the best one to reach me at is paufo@comcast.net. And my first book was called Really Mysterious Pennsylvania. And these are all available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com. And Really Mysterious Pennsylvania deals with cases where people were physically very close to UFOs, Bigfoot, other cryptids. So they're very detailed, very close-range encounters, and some of them are amazing stories. The book that's most popular is Silent Invasion, the Pennsylvania UFO Bigfoot Casebook, and that's the book about that massive wave in 1973 and 74 where we started to go into. It goes the whole story about that strange event up in Uniontown with the UFO and the Bigfoot in the field and all the things that happened. One of the most startling cases in the world that ever happened. It was documented because we were there shortly after it occurred. Many other really amazing cases with UFOs, Bigfoot, other phenomena. And then my latest book is Astonishing Encounters, Pennsylvania's Unknown Creatures, which gets into all kind of cryptid sightings. Very weird case, and a lot of those cases, as you'll see, some of these are things most people have never heard of before, creatures, and some of those cases suggest also that there's more to it than a flesh and blood explanation. So the books are available on Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com.
Well said. And let me give some shout outs of my own and some announcements. First of all, please, everybody, make sure you check out that video I uploaded from the Ancient Alien Hawaii connection that I filmed in Hawaii. It's only 5 minutes, but it's highly produced. I want to get your opinion. What do you think of the petroglyph, the one and only petroglyph, unlike any other there, that show what looks to be a gray alien with very long arms, big eyes, nothing like anything else. Also, please subscribe to YouTube and all these people that are in chat. I want to thank you all for being such kind people and so very engaging to this. I also want to thank those people who are in Pennsylvania who are actually truly excited and happy that we had a show really pretty much from a Pennsylvania researcher talking a lot about it. So definitely we will do it again. And please consider getting the archives. There's a lot of exclusive content. You could do it via the website, drjradiolive.com, or through Patreon. Every single social media account is the same, at DRJ Radio Live. If you want to get a hold of me directly, tag me on Twitter. That's probably the only way. Unfortunately, because of so many things going on. I don't necessarily check the emails as much as I should do because there's so many that come in per day, but I will check you on Twitter. Also, my social media manager, Pam Vrettenberg, she's always on top of social media for me, from Facebook, from everything else you could imagine. She will be happy to answer your questions. And of course, I want to thank Josh Cheris, who is my assistant producer. And also, let me throw out Pam Vrettenberg's website, UnitedTruthSeekers.com. Also, I want to thank Joe Montaldo, station owner of 107.7 FM UPRN, New Orleans, Louisiana. And of course, Deprogrammed Radio, JC, the owner who owns it in the UK. Also, we have to give a shout out to the people at iHeartMedia. I honestly figured by now they would have not allowed such a show like this since they're trying to suppress the information. But hey, the more access, the better for everybody. Also, please, if you have not signed up for a Mind subscription or Mind's page, it's basically a new Facebook, but it's not censored, it's open source, and it pays you in cryptocurrency. Please do check it out. And again, it's the same name, folks, DRJ Radio Live. Again, like that's for everything. Mine's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Flickr, Tumblr, Patreon, whatever you could think of, it's the same. With that being said, folks, this is Dr. J. I will be back here Monday, same time, same place. I may release another video from now until then. Just tap the alert button, the bell, next to the subscribe on YouTube for all the alerts. Now, I officially am signing off.